Thank you. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to thank everyone here for joining us today in this late afternoon. And so upon reading Dr. Sclar's bio, it's very interesting, a lot to talk about here. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. He is the executive director of the American Public Gardens Association. He's also been involved in, well, the organization itself has championed over 600 gardens and 9,300 members located throughout the USA, Canada, Mexico, and 24 other countries. These gardens reach over 121 million visitors per year, continually envisioning a world where public gardens are indispensable. The association itself has spent over 15 years at Longwood Gardens, Kennett Square, Pennsylvania, directing integrated pest management, soils, composting, land stewardship, and other sustainability programs. He holds a bachelor's degree in horticulture from Cal Poly State University, San Luis Obispo, and also a master's and PhD degrees in entomology from Colorado State University, and received the association's professional citation in 2011 for outstanding achievements in public horticulture. Dr. Sclar also promotes gardens, plants, and pollinators coupled with outreach directed at awareness of threats such as invasive species. He is also inaugural chair of NICH, which is the National Initiative for Consumer Horticulture, which raises overall awareness of the $196 billion a year end-use horticulture industry, and also serves on the board of the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, and sits on the advisory council for Seed Your Future to help ever more leaders pursue horticulture and the plant sciences as a career. And now I'm going to transition with Dr. Garcia Chance. And so she's also going to be a speaker for today. And one thing that she's also, that was also interesting from her bio was that she is also an alumni from A&M. And so she received her bachelor's degree, which is in horticulture and landscape architecture, and a PhD from environmental toxicology from Clemson. She has been part of the association since 2016 and has worked at several public gardens and has also appreciated the opportunities the association afforded her. Now she's able to curate and create these opportunities for others. In her spare time, which is nice to hear and to know about, she also loves being in vegetable gardens, traveling, hiking, and working in DIY projects with her husband. And that's all for today. So Dr. Sclar, you can take it away. As far as the bios go on my end.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. To shorten up mine and get us all together, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get us started with the first slide. But an easy way to get to know me is to just know this. I'm sort of three things. I'm somebody who has the opportunity to make the world a better place through people and plants. But the other thing is I'm a plant scientist interrupted. So definitely have a good rooting and background in horticulture and the plant sciences and entomology, and have work experience at a larger public garden. So a good rooting in public horticulture, which is your theme this year. And then the third thing I am is because I have that, and I have that plant science background as well as a good foot in public horticulture. I'm also what happens when they let the inmate run the asylum. So my professional membership association was looking for a new executive director about a decade ago. And I was fortunate enough after serving as interim to be the leader of the association. We've had a good run. I also have a great connection with all things Texas A&M University. Gerald Bergner, who I know you've heard or is going to present a little bit later, was a PhD student, hold a faculty adjunct, and Charlie Hall, who may be somewhere may not be able to attend today, but some of the stats that you're seeing about our industry as a whole is all thanks to Charlie and his work for Seed Your Future and for the National Initiative for Consumer Horn. So, and with that, I'm just going to let Lauren chime in a little bit and fill in the gaps herself on her connections to Texas A&M before we get started. So, Lauren, take it away.
I don't know that I can add much outside of the fact that I had the honor of being a member of the Fighting Texas Aggie class of 2012 as an undergraduate in both horticulture and another degree in landscape architecture, and then had the honor of working under Dr. Arnold for my master's degree while I was there. And so I'm enjoying seeing lots of faces or names, at least, of individuals who I've enjoyed working with through the years. And it's fun to come back and present as not a student. So go ahead, Casey.
Yeah, sure. With that, we're just going to get going. One of the things to remember, we take questions in all their forms. So if you want to wait and hold your thoughts until we get to the Q&A period, we'll ask you some questions, you'll ask us some questions, but also feel free to use chat along the way. And then that way, Vanessa, as our facilitator, can moderate some of those questions as they come up for you. And that's always welcome. So just in getting the ball rolling, for those of you who aren't necessarily familiar with public gardens, this is the first question that we always get asked. Is that, what is a public garden? What does it do? What's its purpose? How is it different, or is it the same as a botanical garden? And along the way, we've dumped a couple of web links in here so that you can go and find out for yourself. But here you can see the definition of what is typically considered a public garden. Some of the words that should jump out at you that are sort of bolded. Certainly research, conservation, and higher learning gardens are about plants, but they are about public education and enjoyment. And we figured we'd spend the first part of this just talking to you about the nature of who comes to public gardens, what their reach and scope are, so that we can concentrate on the public part of it. And then we're going to circle back and talk a little bit more about the plants as well, because gardens are about people and plants. So who's the American Public Gardens Association, and some of the places that we see in some of the sources of data today that you're going to look at. So we're the American Public Gardens Association. We have 600 garden members in about 24 nations. The vast majority of those in the United States, and the vast majority of those are what we would call gardens that we use the term small, but they're facilities that may not be heavily staffed or have high operating budgets, but they have massive impact. And so when you look at those, we have about 10,000 professionals who are working in association public gardens that we take care of. And then some of the way we thought we'd introduce you to us today, this is sort of the materials and methods slide, if you will. We do a wonderful benchmarking platform that's a state-of-the-art, state-of-the-industry benchmarking platform. And so a lot of the data that you're going to see comes from our 2018 to 2019 end of fiscal year surveys. We're about ready to kick off our fiscal 20 end of year surveys with folks and have them dump their data in it. But this is about 102 members participating. The data is pretty robust. And so I think you'll gain a sense for how your typical public garden operates. So, we like to call it the median public garden, and what the median public garden has to offer. So for those of you who are fans of statistics like myself, oftentimes we look at averages, we look at median data, but here you can see some different things. So if you were a normal garden, right? What would you be like? And, you'd be about 83 acres in size. Just as a side note, if you added up the acreage of all the public gardens, they'd be roughly the size of the city of Tucson, Arizona, altogether. So they are certainly important green spaces. Then about 27% of our garden space is, we would say, open to the public. So there's a lot of natural lands, there's a lot of there's a lot of ecological restoration, there's a lot of production that is there. So we're, as businesses, we're property owners and property stewards and good land stewards. And then, we have a constant dedication to the care and maintenance and to the culture of plants. And so when we refer to something as high maintenance, so that's a formally designed, very intensive landscape. Typically, we'll say about 43% of that is high maintenance. And so there's the rest. And so off to the right, you can see a pie chart of how those typical 32 employees break down. And I think the key thing to note is in, royal blue here, or sky blue, you can kind of see there's about 1/4 of the staff of a garden that is a horticulturist. And so if you add that in with the science and conservation and research curation end, you're maybe coming up to about 30%, but that's a really small number. So that's not a majority of people who work at a garden. And so just knowing that there's a whole bunch of other pieces that make that engine run. And that becomes important in building the business case for what our gardens do and how our gardens do it. So, but the next slide, we'll just kind of continue that theme of what we're doing. And so we also are actively engaged in the conservation of plants, and those horticulture staff, that limited number of horticulture staff who are engaged in maintaining that property, there's about 2.2 acres per full-time equivalent person. We gain a lot of help from volunteers, an amazing array of volunteers. We engage a lot of students at all levels, everything from K through 5 on up, and college as well. And so just to make the point again, we have a lot of different people with a lot of different backgrounds who work in the public garden sector. And so, and they come to gardens and horticulture from a suite of different backgrounds. Advantage, they have an amazing diverse skill set, and they see the world in different perspectives, and they can lend to the growth of our profession. Challenge, we don't have the same issue that other horticulture fields and really a lot of other businesses are having at the moment in how we recruit new employees, how we retain intellectual capital in the time of the Great Resignation, and how, as you'll hear, how challenging it is to hire back people when you go from that whiplash of having your business be closed to your business be open. So my hope is that Charlie Hall has talked to you about Seed Your Future and the need for us throughout the plant sciences to engage. I know, Yasmin, who's their executive director at Seed Your Future, is a wonderful resource for your organization, for Texas A&M, and for all of our college and university horticulture programs, as well as for plant science in general. So we are seeking to change this, a bunch of us, but it is a challenge known to our horticulture sector, and it's a wonderful, wealthy profession. We all know that. So when you look at what your normal garden experience is, and this is a great way of saying, here's what your normal garden experienced in 2018 to 2019. Your normal garden had 161,000 visitors, and a lot of those visitors came back. When we talk about a donor, you can think about that as somebody who gave at least $500 to the organization. So that gets at the case for contributed income, for example. And then, 8,000 people educated per institution. As a whole, that equates to about 5.5 million as a whole of people educated per year at our institution, at our member institutions. And so it is worthy of note that about half of those that are educated are in that K through 12 range. And because they're businesses, many gardens are gateless, but in this case, a lot of our businesses do charge admission, and it's usually about $12.50 when we do charge admission. So when you extrapolate that out and you say, okay, so I'm going to radiate that out amongst all 600 members, what does that look like? So that looks like about 120 million people a year. That means that 1 in 6 people in a 25-mile radius have been to your garden. And if you want to, we all love sports, I think, to a different degree or are aware of it. So that basically is right up at greater than 90% of combined NFL, NBA, National Hockey League, and Major League Baseball attendance combined. And certainly in the age of COVID, we probably beat out professional sports attendance in 2020. I think I'm going to brag about that a little bit. But it doesn't seem right in the age of COVID to say that we took the crown away. But it gives you an idea of how people are spending their time, and you'll hear about that popularity. Our whole sector is about 2.3 to 3 billion of the $198 billion end-use horticulture industry. So it just sits in the center of that world. And, I think it's worthy to note that many of our gardens engage in education and in awareness and in programming that benefits the public, and they lose money on it, but they view it as part of their mission and part of their mandate for to make sure that we have everything that we all need and appreciate plants as a society. So the other thing to think about when you're thinking about gardens being places of people and plants, just think about it this way. So we've talked to you about staff members, but then the average, the median garden has 292 volunteers that are contributing almost 13,000 hours to that institution. So for those of you not familiar with running a business, full-time equivalent is about 2,080 hours a year. So you look at that, they're replacing about, well over 6 full-time staff equivalents just with people who are volunteering. And then when you look at plants a little bit more, that garden has almost 3,500 different taxa of plants, different species of plants, different cultivated varieties of plants, remarkable specimen diversity. And as we'll hear, that specimen diversity is actually crucial in the conservation of plants. So I'm going to spin it off here to Lauren in a minute, but, just look at that in context for a minute. Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, for example, was the first non-governmental organization to be invited to participate in the Millennium Seed Bank. And here's, a global conservation effort where we talk about, the Millennium Seed Bank. And for those of you who've seen pictures of it, the vault in Iceland, the Doomsday Vault. And, here in America, we have the same thing. We don't talk that much about it. The seed conservation vault that's in Fort Collins, Colorado, if it had the name of the Ark of the United States for seeds, the Armageddon Resistance Keeper, we probably all respect it more. But, our gardens are contributing to that seed banking effort, but not all plants and plant taxa seed bank well. So when we say that 30% of the world's plants are at risk of extinction and 30% of the tree species in this world are conserved in at least one public garden, and 41 species are only surviving ex situ. And those include some really important, what the International Union for the Conservation of Nature would call, red listed plants. And they include oaks, maples, magnolia, cycads, orchids. And what do you find when you go to a lot of our gardens, or where's our focal points for collecting these plants? We're focusing in on oaks, for example. We worked with the Forest Service to do a cross-Texas conservation effort and collecting effort of trans-pecos oaks. So a lot of this conservation effort kind of rolls under the radar for the different gardens that participate in it, but it doesn't mean that it's not hugely, hugely important for us. So gardens are living libraries of plants. Gardens may have the next cure for cancer. Gardens may have a cure for COVID or another infectious disease that could cause the next pandemic. Gardens are places where we're safeguarding varieties of plants for the next crops. So all that sets the stage for what happens when the world falls off and we have a pandemic. And it's at that point that it's my honor to have Dr. Chance talk to you a little bit more about what happened then. So Lauren, take it away.
Thanks, Casey. So, of course, as everybody knows, this thing called COVID happened. And you can go to the next slide, Casey. And so upon COVID hitting our public gardens, just like universities, just like museums, just like the entire world, really, we saw a shutdown happen. So the association in late March of 2020 actually conducted a survey to try and first establish the impact of COVID. So we had 324 respondents to the survey, and it indicated these sweeping closures that occurred very suddenly and result caused some very profound earned revenue related losses and other economic impacts to the public garden industry. So go ahead. So following that up, because things were happening so rapidly, we then, to further elucidate the impacts of these garden closures, we administered a second survey in April of 2020. And our previous survey was confirmed by these secondary findings that public gardens were heavily impacted by COVID. And in fact, things started to look even a little bit more dire. Between April 15th and April 30th, we had 273 gardens respond to that second survey. And of those, only 3% of those gardens were still fully open. And we saw a shift from partially closed to fully closed by many of our members. Next, Casey. Thank you. So in digging a little deeper into these garden closures and why they were happening in that April survey, we started to kind of ask gardens, why did you close? And we found that the majority of our gardens closed because of mandates. Some closed due to insurance concerns, or in many cases, some were under an umbrella of another organization that required them to close, such as a university. And so those were part of those mandated ones as well. But we saw that many were forced to close because they were told to do so by the government or by their governing entity. We also saw, however, that over 50% of gardens, they could select multiple options. Over 50% of gardens closed also because of staff concerns regarding health and safety. And so I think that just goes to show, too, that our gardens are very concerned about their employees. They care about their employees. And so that was obviously a guiding aspect to this. And then also over half of our reporting gardens felt the decision to close was the right thing to do. And this desire to do the right thing and assist during the pandemic went beyond the closures, as many gardens actually ended up donating PPE to hospitals or emergency responders that they had on site, flowers to local nursery homes and hospitals. This was one of the terms that became applied to the spring of 2020 was the silent spring, or the unseen spring, because so many gardens had these gorgeous, beautiful displays that truly only the workers, or in some cases, no one was there to actually be able to observe. And many of our gardens became very, very entrepreneurial and creative in how to handle that, where they were cutting daffodils and selling daffodils, or cutting daffodils or tulips and actually donating them. So some really creative processes going on there. We also saw this big pivot, and we'll talk about it later, where on a dime, many of our gardens were providing free virtual educational services to their communities. And so obviously this is a strong indication of the connections that many public gardens have with their local communities. Next. So I think it could be expected that in addition to closing, obviously there was a cancellation of programming, a cancellation of fundraising events, and a reduction in overall membership sales. Not only was there a reduction in membership sales, but furthermore, many gardens extended or comped memberships during the 2020 season for members to accommodate those closure periods. And it's actually caused this kind of a future ripple effect in membership renewals, because they extended memberships by a certain number of months, or as I mentioned, kind of comped those. So with this little or no earned or contributed revenue occurring, that usually make up over 90% of a garden's total income. So earned revenue estimates indicated that 87% of gardens canceled, as I mentioned, some programming, as well as their fundraising events. So let's go ahead and move to the next slide. So this then had the effect of then impacting staffing. So while there were concerns following our March survey, whenever we were first seeing some initial staff layoffs and furloughs, that would increase with time, our April survey actually saw that respondents actually only reported 27% of gardens had resorted to staff layoffs or furloughs, and that of those, 32% reported layoffs or furloughs of greater than 50% or more of their staff, while 26% saw between 25% and 50%. So we did see some big hits in terms of our the staffing of public gardens. But that's something to keep in mind. We're going to get to that, come back to that here in just a little bit. Other staffing concerns were the inability to hire seasonal staff and hiring freezes, and that put strain on those employees who remained at work. In addition, 77% of our gardens suspended on-site volunteer programs. And as we talked about earlier, since volunteer programs make such a huge contribution to our member gardens, providing 1 additional hour of labor for every 6 hours worked by garden staff, it really had some big impacts. It was interesting hearing stories from the field in regards to looking at beautiful beds that had previously been free of weeds, and to see, weeds popping up, just a lack of staff there to help maintain these different aspects. Next slide, Casey. So in late June 2020, we conducted a third survey of our garden members and had 189 responses at that point. So we were able to then at that point start asking about some very specific impacts in revenues, as well as the state of the garden. So you can see here that reductions in membership sales and donations further drove a decrease in contributed revenue for more than 60% of our gardens. About 1 in 4 gardens saw some gains in contributed income due to the generosity of members and donors. However, these increases were often offset by losses in earned revenue. And many gardens saw reductions in both contributed and earned revenues of more than 50%, which obviously significantly impacted profit for the year. Next slide. But things were starting to look up. As of June 30th, 58% of responding gardens had either fully reopened or had begun the process of reopening, with 2/3 of the surveyed members hoping to open by the end of September 2020. And the average closure length of the gardens was 80 days, or almost 3 months, with 17% of gardens actually closed for more than 100 days. We've had, as recently as just within the past few months, some gardens finally opened their gates after having been closed for over 1.5 years. Results indicate that while the majority of gardens are reopening slowly, many still remain closed in June of 2020, and only 17% reported being fully open in that June survey. But this period of reopening, it had some really great sunshine and brightness that it brought to our lives, because as was the trend across the horticulture industry, suddenly public gardens were in the spotlight. Public gardens were seen as a place to get away, a place to escape. And all of a sudden we started seeing this movement happening where not only were our attendance numbers returning to where they had been, but they were actually increasing drastically. So while our plan is to conduct a 4th survey to kind of follow up and see where our gardens are at this stage in time, we do have anecdotal evidence in regards to all of our gardens across the board reporting the highest number of attendance they've seen ever. Many of our small gardens were actually so overwhelmed by these high visitation numbers that they were dealing with issues they've never had to deal with before in regards to too many people on a path, or people wanting to, play in beds when they don't have enough lawn space because they've run out because there's so many people in the garden. Some negatives in a way, but overall it was just this amazing experience to watch so many people coming back in droves. This has then in return resulted in increases in donations, increases in membership numbers, increases in entrance fee dollars. And not only that, but with it, we saw actually an increase in the diversity of our attendees. So as people were coming back, we were attracting in people who had never visited public gardens before, who had never set foot in a botanical garden or an arboretum. And we're starting to see different types of people as part of that audience. And we saw as well with that increased interest in home gardening and horticulture, an increased interest in using public garden resources and the different outlets that we have available. Casey, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I would just say, to wrap it up, one of the things, when you look at gardens being so dependent on earned revenue, like 6 to 7 out of every $10 is coming from earned revenue, and about 2 out of every $10 is coming from contributed income. So to see a slight rise from $2 to $3 in contributed income, that's fantastic. But it's really that membership and that attendance and our ability to handle it. There's a very popular person who blogs on marketing and in the cultural sector. Her name's Colleen Dillenschneider. And so she had been looking at and tracking trends in cultural institution data. And at one point in time, botanical gardens were the most desired visited destination, more than the beach, and sharing that with zoos as the place to go when nobody wanted to go to a movie theater and nobody wanted to go to an art gallery. So, and we see that trend continuing because we can be socially distant at a garden. We can enjoy some things outside that maybe we thought that we could only enjoy inside before. So with that, we'll head to the next slide.
So again, just kind of some anecdotal evidence on the association side, some indicators of just kind of how well our gardens recovered and are tending to do right now is reflected in our own association evidence. And so we've seen a very high institution member retention. So whenever an institution joins our organization, they don't join just as an institution. Every single one of their staff members by default become a member of the association. So for example, the gardens at Texas A&M University are members of the association, and every single one of their staff members are by default a member of the association as well. So what was interesting is that we saw kind of a very steady line in regards to our institution membership retention. But what was really, really exciting was that more and more staff at those organizations were being added to rosters in order to take advantage of the different professional development opportunities the association offered. So we actually saw an increase in overall membership, even though our institution membership remained steady. We also saw, as kind of part of that, increases in what we call our professional communities. We have different professional communities where people can interact, get advice, get feedback on different things that they're experiencing, from plant collections to research to membership development. And we actually saw some of the highest engagement numbers we've seen in those forums really ever. And that activity remains to this day to continue to increase. And so that has been really exciting to watch those conversations and those answers and that truth finding happen in those forums. And so in result, it's kind of impacted the association in that we're, like many, many institutions, including Texas A&M, trying to meet this new demand for online accessible training, professional development in ways that have not been done before. And so we're really looking towards how do you conduct virtual trainings? How do you get that same experience when you can't be together? But as a result of that, actually, Casey, did you want to add something to here before I go on to the next slide?
No, I mean, as I transition to the next slide, the only thing that I would say is that, our roadmap to leadership in professional development runs all the way from engaging someone who's just starting off in our profession to somebody who maybe is leading or sitting on the board of a garden. So it's great to have a pipeline for that.
Absolutely. So that has resulted in this increase in access as a byproduct of the increase in virtual offerings. And so I'm sure, y'all are very familiar with kind of what's been happening, but as more and more things have become hybrid or virtual, it's really opened the doors for more individuals in general to be able to get the information they need. And so as Casey mentioned, we've really seen an increase in kind of those, what we term emerging professionals, or individuals who are new to our profession, being able to really get access to resources that maybe previously their institution wasn't willing to pay to send them to go get. And so that's been a really great benefit. And we've seen that reflected in our members as well. So this is actually a chart from our member organizations who were reporting back on their own personal increases in virtual offerings. And so you can see that 80% had an increase in virtual offerings. And then greater than 60% of our gardens actually offered that virtual content for free. And so that's truly been really amazing in terms of the amount of reach we've been able to see happening within the public garden realm. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to you, Casey.
Yeah, sure. And, you know, one of the other things that as we end on that from a business case scenario for gardens, so we're doing all this and we're not charging for it. And that I think is wonderful. It's also a challenge as well as an opportunity, particularly as we move forward into the future. So in bringing this home to y'all, I like to think, you know, what does the future hold for public gardens? You know, where are we heading and where are gardens heading from here? And I like to look at this as an alliteration when we talk about hope. Gardens are places of hope and places where people combine horticulture, opportunities, occupations, plants, the profession of horticulture, and some ecological and environmental principles, and they find them all here. And when you reduce it to its essence and why we think our gardens have the capacity to be resilient centers of their community and to offer hope, you know, it begins with the place to go to just kind of disconnect from what is a very discordant world, from a world where you're bombarded with technology and bombarded with opinions and bombarded with a very polarized America. Our gardens are places where you can get away from all that and just kind of enjoy the sacred beauty of a garden. There are also places where we increasingly go to heal. And there are places where we go to work. And particularly when we're looking at one of the unspoken crises in mental health that we have in America, there's some really great work by Dr. Don Rakow and Greg Ellis out of Cornell University about, you know, prescriptions for nature and prescriptions for nature on college campuses, utilizing the college campus arboretum or a public garden, but then also just for children in general to get out and learn and connect with nature. There's a very famous book, Last Child in the Woods, about saving our children from, you know, quote unquote, nature deficit disorder. But it's really more than that. You know, it's getting outside. It's getting to be a place where you can look at. The other thing that when we talk about hope, you know, we're talking about food and we're talking about connecting people to plants, to food, to security. This is what greets you over on the left when you walk into Tower Hill Botanic Garden in Worcester, Mass. You know, plants are providing you with all the food you eat and all the air you breathe. To rack it down to its essence in today's society, you know, not everybody is a member of a horticulture science department like they are at Texas A&M. And so when you go to the grocery store and see somebody and you tell them, you know, hey, without plants, we all die. How many of those people do you really think know and understand that? You know, that plants are responsible for breath, but everybody's at the grocery store to buy food. And so when you make that connection to them about how plants are inescapable in gourmet food, in how the challenges of agriculture translate to supply chain issues and everything else, it's a great learning opportunity to connect with that. And, you know, when we're talking about that from a large agribusiness perspective, it's also really important. Every place where we're protecting habitat, every place that we're performing ecological restoration to save pollinators, every place that we are going where we have a living library of plants we can use in research and conservation, that's protecting our environment and offering hope. This graph, you know, this map of the U.S., if you look at the yellow to red hotspots, the yellow to red hotspots is essentially the impact of species diversity of crop wild relatives. And then when you look at the green dots on that map, that's where all the public gardens are. So the vast concentration of our public gardens are also located in the vast concentration of where crop wild relatives are located in the USA. And the USA is number 3 in the world in terms of diversity for crop wild relative conservation. So that's a huge impact that we can have that'll protect food and agriculture for us going forward. And then just in looking at places where we can educate others, excite people, growing the next generation of horticulturists, whether it's just a walk out in the woods or whether it's getting to know your favorite butterfly or pollinator in a whole new and different way, gardens are offering that and offering that for all. And so I want to just go ahead and kind of end at the beginning when we talk about hope, and we talk about places for education, and we talk about all the things that go with the letter E, education, exhibits, and also environment, but then also economics. And when I say we end at the beginning, this is a statement from our founder, Robert Pyle. And I think it's important enough that I'll read it off to you. It would appear that our statesmen are willing to appropriate billions for battleships and engines of destruction, while unwilling to grant a pitiable pittance of a pauperium for projects of constructive significance, such as the plant laboratories we advocate. And so certainly while several, but not all of our organizations, of our member organizations, were able to qualify for funding under the Paycheck Protection Program or the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program or another loan program, they never even made it. They just clocked over 50% of our organizations were able to qualify for that type of assistance. And so, you know, we had done some political advocacy. We're going to continue to do political advocacy so that we're seeing the appropriate share of federal dollars getting channeled to our facility. And just as a great aside, Robert Pyle is one of the great unknown heroes of horticulture. He invented the mass production and mail out of roses. I know that Star Roses is, you know, active and has had a presence in Texas at different points in time. And rose production obviously is very important to Texas. But, you know, here's a person who started the mail order rose business, founded our association and several other important horticultures, and then also introduced the peace rose, the very last plant that flew out from France before the German occupation in World War II. So he was somebody who knew a little bit about plant conservation of those things that aren't necessarily just plant species, but are important varieties. So with that, we're running right at about 45 minutes. And what I'd like to do is we've talked, we know that some of you all will have questions. And so, Lauren, if you don't have anything you want to add, I think we'll switch to the next slide where we sort of have our question for you. So, Lauren, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Go for it.
All right. So what we want to know from you is that we're not alone with the challenges and opportunities that we have. We have a distinct interconnectedness with the horticulture industry of today and all its different facets. And so our question to you is, how can we as public gardens capture the momentum that's happening in the garden and horticulture industry? So I'm going to end our slideshow, stop the share, and open it up for facilitated questions.
I'd like to ask Lauren a question that would take advantage of her background here from the many years she was at Texas A&M, and that is, how can we make our garden here an indispensable asset for students? I admire the alliteration of Mr. Pyle when he talks about a pitiable pittance of a pauperium, and sometimes I feel like the university administration has a huge amount of money that they can build new buildings, but when it comes to making sure that the garden is continuously supported, we don't get a lot of funds to do that. But is it going to take a wave of student interest in the gardens to be able to get that going? Or Lauren, based on your observations from when you were here, how can we better get the students involved in the garden so that the university can see that the students are very much depending on the garden as a as a place of relaxation and study?
I think my first initial reaction to that is just to say that you're not alone at all in that regard. I think we see this across a lot of our small gardens in general, who tend to be university and college gardens. And so I think that unfortunately, I don't know if you remember, but I actually graduated literally the year that they approved the creation of the garden. And so whenever I was there, I did not even get to see the ground break. But I think that, you know, there is this movement that's happening, and that's kind of what, you know, our last slide was alluding to. There's this general movement happening in horticulture as a whole, that we're seeing, where more and more people, especially the younger generation, are becoming very engaged in growing plants at home, in their yards. I was watching the Astros the other night, which is very exciting.
Oh, the commercial where the guy talks about, the commercial where the guy talks about horticulture. Yes.
And he says the word horticulture, like not just like, oh, I do this thing in my backyard with plants. He says horticulture. And I think that this is it's an exciting time, because we're seeing this become more and more prevalent, where there's this interest in plants. And so that's where, like, how can we capture this momentum? How can we keep this going? I saw somebody had posted in here a question about, you know, how long do we think this surge in attendance is going to last? We don't know, but we want to capture it. We want it to go on indefinitely. And so that's what we're all asking this question, is like, what can we do? Like, how can we capture this audience and these new people who are connecting with plants and really keep the momentum going? And so I think right now, of any time, is the time that college and university gardens are really going to be able to have that opportunity to step up and shine in that regard, because we're seeing younger and younger people become engaged in gardening. It's no longer this 60-year-old who, I'm sorry, that's very young as I'm getting older. Let's go with 100-year-old out there. You know, we're getting younger and younger as we're engaging in gardening. I know even I, as sad as it may be, I did not have a full-blown vegetable garden prior to the pandemic. Now I'm addicted. I can't get out of my vegetable garden. I grew plenty of, you know, ornamentals, but now I'm addicted to vegetable gardening as well. And so I think there's a shift that's happening, and I think that it's not a great answer, but I think you've got to capture that shift that's occurring and draw them into the garden and help them understand, you know, how they can continue that passion they've found.
Lauren, I just wondered if you talked about the fact that many of the gardens relied heavily on volunteers, and we were just beginning to rely heavily on volunteers when the pandemic set in. And now that we're opening up, and we've had a tremendous demand, we never closed here, and we've had a tremendous demand for the gardens, and we're seeing increasing requests now from school children and those types of entities to come in and use the garden. But yet we still can't have volunteers right now unless they're specifically associated with a student organization or class. And I wonder, how are your gardens dealing with the restrictions on volunteers versus the increase in demand?
So that's a great question. We are going to be putting together, we actually have a webinar planned for January that you should definitely attend. But I'll give you the sneak peek. It's basically about going hybrid, and how, for example, with volunteer programs, they're actually utilizing volunteers virtually, because they're, at least, I don't know what kind of restrictions you have, but they're allowed to use volunteers so long as they don't step into the gardens. And so they're taking advantage of these volunteers through virtual capacities to do things with plant collections, to do things with education development and programming materials and things along those lines. And so I don't know what your capacity looks like. And I know that obviously a huge part of this is then having the staff who can work with those volunteers. That's always a limitation. But I would encourage you to check out that, because this shift to hybrid and virtual has really opened up some interesting doors, even in regards to, for example, fundraising and reaching donors on a broader level than just locally, that we haven't seen before. And so there, like I said, that webinar in January will be kind of exploring a little bit more of that and some of the different ways that people have done that. But Yeah, and there's plenty of resources too on our website if you're interested in seeing what some other people have done. That's kind of it's a terrible answer in a way, but my recommendation is to look at that virtual outlet.
Yeah, I'd say that a lot of that question comes down to risk management practices and that are present at your facility, and you certainly have the capacity to drive those activities, particularly if you're seeing it in other branches of the university where volunteerism is being accepted, how you have the capability to do that. But that's how a lot of our gardens are looking at it. The decision to bring back volunteers is viewed as a risk management matter. And a lot of them are very successful in bringing them back. And if they're not successful in bringing them back, they're successful at making the case to get more money to get staff involved. And so that's been I think a really good benefit. And we have some wonderful. Sorry, go ahead, Lauren.
I'm so sorry. I was just going to mention too, that's been an interesting observation we've seen too, is some of our gardens have actually started hiring their volunteers as part-time staff because we're like most horticulture industry right now, we're having a really hard time finding seasonal staff. And so in many cases, it's actually been a transition of volunteers into that kind of seasonal or part-time staff kind of placement. So that's kind of another interesting aspect of that. Sorry, Casey, didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I think it's a great point, Lauren. And you look at the volunteer cadre, and one of the things that I think is really important and is a challenge and an opportunity for our industry is that the vast majority of those volunteers, especially pre-pandemic and then moving through pandemic, are folks who are coming from a place of privilege. They've got some free time on their hands. They're able to, they may be, we should say a little bit, they're not certainly young in terms of age. And so we're not really building our institutional knowledge and our intellectual capital if we're solely relying on that. So all that's really important.
I know we've got some. The risk management.
Sorry, go ahead.
The risk management reason behind what you're saying, Casey, is that when a person is a employee of an institution, they tend to be covered by the overall liability policy of the institution. But if the person is a volunteer, they're not covered by that liability policy. So,
and I would say absolutely in certain public environments that's correct. However, there certainly is volunteer insurance coverage. Full disclosure, one of the best partners our association has is a risk management company, an insurance company, and they provide a lot of articles and a lot of information and a lot of service to our industry. And they're not, they may not possibly be Texas A&M's insurer, but they certainly are contributing to that thought process about how you go about getting that volunteer service rider and some other things. We've had some great questions in chat too, and so I want to give Vanessa the floor to ask some of the questions that are coming out of chat. So go ahead, Vanessa.
Thanks, Dr. Sclar. So Dr. Klein posted a question: did the pandemic have an effect on conservation/research of CWRs due to all of the closures?
So I don't have scientifically verifiable evidence, but sitting on the board of a conservation, in this case an insect conservation based organization for my service work, I can tell you that it probably did have a huge impact on the ability to go out and collect plants and conduct research to do plant collecting. Because these gardens were closed, because they barely had enough resources to keep the living collections that they had living during that time. And I'll elaborate on why that was in just a second. That ability to go out and secure more crop wild relatives was definitely impacted and definitely impaired. And so now as these gardens are opening up a little bit more, and quite frankly, we're seeing a resurgence in the interest of plants and gardening, that's going to trickle down to conservation of plants and hopefully will lead to more crop wild relative securing of those. and then in terms of using those. I think also just the search to try to find a cure for COVID also, I think, is has an important relationship to that. We didn't really cover it today, but one of the really acute impacts that happened at the beginning of all this for botanical gardens and public gardens, especially in different states, was the reasons those closures got mandated and stuck so hard was because many governments in many states and many local municipalities viewed us as museums, enclosed spaces that weren't considered to be essential work. So it took our industry just about, I think, almost a month in some cases for our gardens to get essential worker designation to have people come and actually water plants and care for plants and maintain plants. And so it was really scary there in March and April, trying to justify yourself as an essential place to work.
And I'll just, not to go too long on this question, but I just wanted to throw into the chat too, a great example though is like the Southeast Plant Conservation Alliance. I know they actually increased the number of times they were meeting during the pandemic because they were able to get together remotely, talk through some different plantings. And so actually as a result of that, they had a better list of kind of red listed plant species that they were going to target as soon as things started opening up. And I already know anecdotally, there's a lot of plant finding trips that have started to resume already, people traveling and starting to look again and start to collect those plants. So it's exciting to see that maybe while we were set back during the pandemic, the comeback might be stronger. So
yeah, great point, Lauren.
Yes, Ed, I'm seeing more questions here. So along the same lines from Fu, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing it. How do you get those data? From example, and he quotes, 54% of reporting gardens felt the decision to close the garden was the right thing to do. Did you guys do online survey to collect answers or phone calls?
Yeah, that's a great question too. And what I'd say is we do online surveying. We use many of the same tools that you all had used at Texas A&M. We use Qualtrics. A lot of it has to do with how we're asking the question and knowing how our members are going to ask the question. So you really, when you construct any survey question, you really got to know what do you want to do with the information that they're bringing back to you, try to gain as much information as you can out of it. So we literally asked, were you told to close? And, and another choice response was, we felt closing was the right thing to do. Check all that apply. And we definitely saw that. It was dramatically low. You would be surprised, but if I recall correctly, the number that said that we closed solely for insurance reasons was really low. It was well below 20%. So, right, yeah, Lauren's holding up on one hand. It was really low. So that just shows you how much our garden institutions care about people and aren't just concerned about litigation.
Okay, thank you. And so one last question, unless someone else has another question, but here Arnold posted, just curious, but what percentage of your gardens are free and open to the public without a charge?
So that's running, and we're going to see how it updates with this next survey, but it runs about 50-50. And so there may not be a gate surcharge, but then what's happening is, the institution is trying to make sure that it can gain what it's able to gain from membership or from events. So that gate fee becomes important. And the gate fee became also important because as our gardens were opening again, and I think this kind of gets at one of the other questions that was asked a little bit earlier on, is, we had to have these gardens practice social distancing. And so that gated aspect allowed them to practice social distancing in many cases and to offer programming outside or different things, but it became a ticketed opportunity. So time ticketing kind of became the way of the day, and that allowed gardens to have more attendees because people had to buy a ticket up front. And so that also raises, I think, some very challenging questions about access. So a lot of these time ticketing systems require that you have an email address, or require that you have a smartphone, or assume that you had a computer. So as we move forward into the future and we're thinking about accessibility, these are the great challenges that our gardens face in opening back up. That's also a wonderful opportunity.
And I think, you know, knowing especially y'all are who we are talking to, university gardens, I think were one of the hardest hit in terms of how to open back up, not having their property fenced, right? How do you regulate how many people are in an area at one time? And that really hit our college and university gardens hard. But I think that I don't know where I'm going with this. I don't know if there's been a solution, is I guess where I'm going. But and it's this kind of broad issue that we're seeing across a lot of our college and university gardens that are trying to grapple with that. One of the things that we've seen potentially an increase in is charging for parking to park close to the garden, and then capitalizing on that, or using that parking aspect as a way to kind of control how many people are in the garden at any time.
Parking is probably, Mike can comment on this, but parking is the #1 bane of our garden right now, because the university controls all the parking as a profit-making enterprise. And so it's very, very difficult to find open parking places near the garden.
And we not only do not get any of the funds from the parking, but we actually cannot even get our volunteers free parking. So that's problematic, and that's something we're trying to address in phase 2 of the gardens. We have some solutions, I think, for that on there.
Yeah, many accessibility challenges to face like that, you know, especially if you don't have a methodology of public transportation nearby to be able to serve that location. So then, you know, you're challenged based on when and where you can have volunteers, and when and where you can have visitors.
Okay, that pretty much sums up this seminar, and I want to thank the presenters from Texas A&M. I'm sorry, your thing, yeah. Dr. Garcia Chance and Dr. Sclar for joining us today, and